So this is actually a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a while, and I just saw a post on one of the Majority Report subreddits about populism, and I think just the thoughts that I've been having recently, I wanted to make a video to kind of talk about this because kind of reflection and kind of questioning, like, is populism the right move? Is it the right thing to believe? Is it dead? And I'm kind of going to explain to you guys in this video why I personally am not a populist anymore. I think I definitely was before. It's kind of the idea of, hey, whatever the ordinary people support, that is what you should support. But there are many problems, and the reason why I have Saagar Enjeti and Kyle, and I know it should be flipped, right? Because kind of like, I think Kyle is the big representation on the online left anyways, like the populist left guy, and then Saagar is the populist right guy. Again, we use heavy quotation marks with populist, right populist, because it's kind of fake, right? It's almost not really real. It's more like crypto fascism. But these are kind of the two big representatives, and that's why I have them up here. But I think that there is some backlash from that, from someone like maybe a Sam Cedar or someone like that, from this kind of quote unquote populism, right? And for me personally, I think that populism is not a good way to go, or the right way to go, I should say, for a couple of reasons. First off, I would just say that the big, honest, main problem with populism is simply on a logical level. It's not logical to say that whatever the people support, whatever is popular is correct. Like whatever the people support in polls. Oh, hey, 60% of people support Medicare for all, ergo we should adopt Medicare for all. Now, that's not logical simply because it's an Argumentum Ad Populum Fallacy. And so you're saying, oh, okay, well, whatever is popular is good. But that's not the case, obviously. That's not the case at all. One example is like fast food is the most eaten food out of any kind of food. Is that because it's the best tasting food? Of course not. It's because, and we know in economics, inferior goods, like the demand for certain shitty goods like McDonald's goes up as your income goes down. So the less money you make, the higher demand you have for McDonald's, as opposed to the more money you make, you'd have more demand for like steak or something more fine and expensive. Another thing is like the video games that always sell the most copies, the movies, all that, they're never the best quality. They're always just the most commercial. Same thing with like Drake's music, right? He's always selling the most copies and stuff, but his music is clearly not the best. So I would just say on a pure logical level, it's just not right. I think they're just blindly saying, oh, hey, well, whatever the people support or whatever has the most support in polls is correct is completely wrong, because there's lots of things in the past and even now that most people will support, but it's actually wrong, like racism or slavery or whatever, that kind of thing. Another really big issue is that it actually ends up conflating what the average man believes is best for the average man and what actually is the best for the average man. And I think that this conflation is actually the biggest mistake that you can possibly make, because they're two completely different things. And so I used to be of somebody who did think like, oh, okay, well, whatever the average man thinks is best for him is the best thing for him, and ergo we should support that, right? I think that that's actually not true now that I've kind of gotten more educated. I'm learning more and that kind of thing, and I'm seeing how much information that you have to actually learn to know any of this stuff. I know that it's really shocking to a lot of people, but just because you watch secular talk or you read CNN doesn't mean you know about politics. Knowing politics, there's a science behind it, right? Things like Zoller's RES model or triangulation, like Bill Clinton was famous for his triangulation, right? It's like, oh, hey, you got like the far left on this side, the far right on this side. Hey, I'm going to triangulate and rise above, and I'm going to bring the new center, or like, knowing sort of the analytical frameworks of the impotent imperial entrepreneurial theory of the presidency, or sort of knowing what is a first past the post voting system, what is proportional representation, even like ranked choice voting. I feel like if I were to put a microphone to you right now and ask you to explain to me what that is, you wouldn't be able to do it. These are very important things to understand, and there's a lot of actual stuff behind this. Debates don't have any impact on presidential elections, for example. Just random stuff like, RFK was never going to win the primary. He was not going to win that race at all. It wasn't like, people think he got assassinated. He was on his way to win. That's not what was going to happen. But so just because you watch secular talk and that stuff doesn't, I know that political science has been so devalued to this point that it's just like, oh, well, anybody can just know politics. That is the equivalent to thinking that like you can read WebMD and be a doctor or a nurse. It's not the same thing. I know, as much as you want to believe that, because I think that it's become just so sort of democratized. Truth has become fully democratized. This is another big issue of mine. And the big casualty in all of this ends up being education, right? And so people who have spent a lot of time, and I can say this now as I'm getting educated personally and in school, learning political science and economics now, there's a lot of work and a lot of learning that goes into this stuff that the average person who's maybe a steel worker or an engineer or a computer scientist or whatever, they don't know any of this stuff. And actually, well, you might ask, well, okay, well then how the hell, okay, Sahil, well, tell me this then, buddy. How does democracy work if people aren't educated, right? Because the theory is, like, the folktale theory is like, oh, well, in a democracy, people get educated on the issues and then they vote based on, those issues. That's not true at all. But the number one reason why democracy is still able to survive, there's a couple of other ones, like something called the magic of aggregation and stuff like that. But the number one thing is called information shortcuts or heuristics, right? And so you might look at what Bernie Sanders endorses or AOC endorses or someone like that endorses, someone who is highly aware of politics, and then you'll vote for whatever they endorse. So you're essentially copying their answers. And in doing so, despite you or anybody in the population not being a highly informed voter, they emulated a highly informed voter by copying the choices of a highly aware voter. So maybe you vote for whatever Ralph Nader says to vote. You're a Green Party member, so you know that he's going to represent your beliefs, so you copy his votes down. You are now emulating a highly aware voter, even though you're not one, right? And so that's the main reason. But the thing is, we're losing deference. There's two problems, really. We're losing deference to those who are experts, highly aware, knowledgeable, etc. But also a lot of the heuristics that are coming out of the people who are supposed to be giving the cues to voters are turning into complete dog shit. But really the big problem with this is it ends up meaning that education is worthless. And I think that it's very lazy and just incorrect on all grounds to advocate for populism. I'm not even really sure what kind of the best argument for populism would be. I mean, in terms of the definition here, this from the Britannica, I guess their little library. It says populism, political program or movement that champions or claims to champion the common person, usually by favorable contrast with the real or perceived elite or establishment. Populism usually combines elements of the left and right, opposing large businesses and financial interests, but also frequently being hostile to established liberal, socialist, and labor parties. So that's going to come from the right wing, or at least the parts after liberal. But I think we've gotten to the point now where our anti-elite rhetoric and discourse is so watered down and worthless that it's almost as invaluable as the elites themselves, if not even worse. We've just gotten to the point where it's like you just say all elites are bad, and then anything associated with them, like higher education, things of that nature, like colleges are being so defunded now because of this ideology that not only exists on the right, but it also exists on the left as well, with Bernie Sanders people, where it's like, oh, well, these highly educated people may be supporting liberal things, but they're not populist, so they're wrong or whatever. I think that it's sort of I think populism is just a very appealing sort of ideology to people who are new to the political scene. I was obviously, new at the time, and I wasn't really educated on anything prior. I don't even know why I had any viewers, but I think that's a bad sign of things. But I think that as you kind of learn more and move on, I've talked about this in the audience I have with a bunch of people who are fans of Kyle who kind of moved away. The more you kind of learn, the more you mature and get educated, you start to realize that populism is just it's childish. I don't want to really hurt people, but it is a kind of childish, very childlike thinking mode where it's like, oh, well, if a lot of people support, then good. That's not only that, it's just intellectually so lazy, because it's just okay, well, it just gives you this blank slate where if anything has plus 50% support and is supported by the common man or whatever, hey, well, it's the right thing to do. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is Medicare for all is not the right policy position because people support it. It's the right policy position because it is the most efficacious plan to deliver on our goals, right? Our goals are ensure everybody, bring costs down, and to maintain, the best quality that we possibly can. Those are really our three main goals, right? And so Medicare for all is not the right policy because people support it. I don't support Medicare for all because it's a populist thing, because ordinary people support it. I support Medicare for all because it is the right policy on its own, inherently on its own, independently. So that's the direction that we need to move towards, where we say, okay, we're not just supporting stuff because it's popular, but maybe you could try to argue the reverse. Hey, it's popular because it's the right policy, but then you're not really doing populism. I mean, you're just kind of like running on the back of that, right? And so I think that we need to move in that direction. That's definitely where I'm at mentally, personally. And so I support those kinds of things. And the thing is that, the ordinary man is working like 40 hours a week plus, barely making ends meet. I have not even the slightest of a clue how that person is supposed to know what the best policies to help them is. I don't even know how that's possible, because it's like you're barely making ends meet, like you're barely getting food on the table, might not even have healthcare, like you're dying. And so let's say those are the issues, right? The plaguing issues are, let's say, wealth inequality, lack of health insurance, all this stuff, right? So you identify that those are the problems. We can tell that from the ordinary man's experience. But to then make the populist jump that the ordinary man also knows the cures to those ailments is comical. I mean, I don't want to be like pissing anybody off or hurting anyone's feelings, but again, that's just insane. The idea that you would somehow know the solutions to those problems is crazy, because it requires so much knowledge and education and all of that stuff to be able to answer them. In fact, the whole point is you want those people to be more educated, right? Like that's the goal, because they've been stripped of the opportunity to get educated and have better opportunities as a result of that. And so it just becomes this big issue where I think populism is completely wrong in almost every way that you're kind of looking at it. And so there will be a lot of situations where maybe the ordinary man has the wrong solution to the problem. And, we know that the populist movement was very racist in like the 1900s and such, right? It was very racist and such in those kinds of ways, but also the idea that hey, we're losing some jobs in the steel industry or whatever in the Rust Belt, and so let's put in tariffs on steel. What is a tariff? It's a tax on an import. So if a company wants to import a good into the country, I'm trying to think if the importer pays the tax. I think the importer, like the company, like let's say Ford was importing stuff, I think they would pay the tax. I don't think the Chinese company selling it would put the tax on it. But the idea of a tariff is, okay, let's artificially inflate the price of goods coming in from outside of the nation, and so it'll make homegrown steel more attractive, right, for companies. So whatever company, Ford or whoever is getting steel, will buy it from American steelmakers instead. And that sounds like a legit thing if you don't really know much about like economics or just any of that kind of stuff. That might sound like, oh wow, like that's the solution, but it's horrible, it's awful, it's terrible, because the problem ends up being if you put a tax on an unfinished good, a raw material, there are a lot of companies that use that raw good to create finished goods, right? So even Richard Wolff said this doesn't work. Even like straight up communists said this doesn't work because it doesn't even make like basic sense. But it's like, if you do that, industries like Coca-Cola or whoever that all use steel, car companies, etc., they're all going to have to lay off workers due to the increase in prices of the input goods, right? So there's going to be more jobs lost from the steel workers being saved, then consumers are all going to have to pay higher prices. And who is most impacted by higher prices? Poor and working class people. So if the working class person now goes to Ford to buy a car and it's jacked up multiple thousands or whatever, even 1,000, right? It doesn't have to be much for a working class person to really struggle. That's going to hurt your pockets more. And then the international laborers, who are able to, feed their family as a result, no longer have a job. It's a horrible, horrible policy. Like it's really, really ridiculous. But I used to think that was a good idea, but I didn't really know anything. Again, even Richard Wolff, like communist dude, said that. You can go check out my video on Ben Shapiro and I think like Trump tariffs or something. I had to put the clip in there. You try to search it. Hopefully you can find it. But those are kind of my thoughts on this kind of idea. I would say that in terms of populism, I can't consider myself a populist anymore. And if you kind of want like a more sort of a posteriori sort of a translation of that, I am not supporting Medicare for all. I don't think I ever did, to be honest, but I'm not supporting Medicare for all because polls show that it's more popular than not, that more people support it than not. I support it because it's going to help the common man the most. And so for me, my sort of driving ideology is what helps the ordinary person the most. That's what's the driving force. Not what does the ordinary man think will help them the most, because that's oftentimes not going to be right. Because of their circumstances, they don't have the ability to gain the education or knowledge that they need to be able to figure that out. These questions are really, really difficult. How to solve poverty, how to get people healthcare, etc. These are not there's not easy answers for all this stuff where it's just super easy. Anybody can get it. Otherwise, we probably would have solved it already, right? But I support it because it is the right policy, because it's going to help people the most, and it's going to be the most efficacious from our three goals. And so we're now to a point where there's sort of your progressiveness is determined not by the policies, how progressive the policies you support are, but rather these dogmas that we have. So for example, like the whole free trade thing or whatever, even if we know for sure that 100% that trade will bring more jobs and it'll lose and it'll actually help people overall. But it's like, oh no, that's the liberal, neoliberal world order or whatever, that kind of thing. It's just progressive dogma as opposed to, let's start with first principles, right? That's my guiding sort of thing, is first principles of we want to help the working class be able to, have healthcare, buy food, etc. That's the goal. And so the question is, how do we get there? How we get there, we don't really care what it is. We don't really care what the method is. But the problem is we get so hung up on, we don't really care about the first principles anymore. It is more about the end, or the means, I care about the ends, but it seems a lot of progressives should care about the means. So for example, let's hypothetically say, if you could undeniably prove, which I think it is undeniably proven, but like trade is good for jobs, consumption, etc., for working class people all around, even if it was like undeniably true, proven, like a lot of progressives would still say no, just because it doesn't fit the dogma of what the means has to be. It can't be the neoliberal world order or whatever thing that they want to say. So that's kind of where I'm at with this. I think populism itself is pretty just dead in general. I think that if you're still kind of falling into the Kyle Kulinski Saagar kind of thing, you're probably just, you might be new, or you must really be stuck if you're still kind of consuming that kind of content. I feel like you kind of level up at least to a point where you're watching like a Humanist Report or Rational National or someone like that, who's not just like this sort of brazenly, just kind of like intellectually lazy sort of, hey, I'm a populist, bro. It's just so lame, right? And so I don't know. I'm curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are. It seemed like those three people that responded to that Reddit post were not fond of populism themselves. But I even saw a video of Tupac, like using the Argumentum Ad Populum Fallacy, like pointing it out. It was like, oh, MC Hammer's selling this many records. And he's like, hey, well, crack is really popular too. Doesn't mean crack is good. He's right. Even Pac is out here. That's funny stuff. Anyways, though, so the goal is to help the working class person be able to pay their food bills or whatever. How we get there, A, doesn't matter. B, it requires a lot of education and knowledge and that kind of thing to know why it would work. And we're not looking for, at least I'm not looking for, what the average man thinks will help them the most, but rather what will help the average man the most. And so those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down below.